One crisp winter evening in Miami, at exactly 8:20 p.m., two young lovers drove along a quiet, stretched-out highway, both wrapped in matching hoodies, wrapped in each other's world. It was just a night out, nothing more, or so it seemed. Minutes later, metal screamed, glass shattered, and a life was gone. In the haze of chaos, one choice was made, a choice that would change everything, a choice born out of love, or perhaps something far darker. From that moment, one of them would walk away, while the other would vanish behind cold concrete walls for almost a decade. And when those prison gates finally swung open, she thought she was stepping back into the arms of the man she'd sacrificed everything for. But love, true or imagined, has a strange way of evolving. Sometimes it doesn't just fade. Sometimes it twists into something unrecognizable. This is the story of Alice Jones, of the man she trusted, and of the night she learned that freedom isn't always the end of a sentence. Before we continue, this is the Crime Catalogue. Stay tuned, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. The sun had barely begun to warm the streets of Miami when Alice Jones's day started, as it often did, in quiet routine. 25 years old, born and raised in the city's pulse, she carried herself with the quiet steadiness of someone accustomed to being needed. The daughter of a retired firefighter and a church choir leader, she had grown up with discipline on one side and unwavering compassion on the other. Her neighbors described her as the one you can call at midnight if you're in trouble, a title she never asked for but lived up to without hesitation. By day, she split her time between caring for patients as a part-time nursing assistant and handling odd favors for friends or family who trusted her discretion. She was loyal to a fault, not one to talk much about herself, preferring to listen, an open ear and a gentle word for whoever sought her out. Samuel Brooks's world couldn't have been more different. At 30, he had returned to Miami with the polish and self-assurance of someone who had spent the last few years in English lecture halls, earning a master's in international business. The only son of a prominent real estate developer, Samuel was raised behind the gates of private schools and exclusive clubs. Tall, handsome, and effortlessly charming, he carried privilege like an invisible shield. Yet beneath that charisma was an unspoken expectation that the world would smooth over his mistakes, that someone else would quietly patch the cracks in his image. For most of his life, someone always had. It was the summer of 2012 when their paths crossed. Alice and Samuel. A mutual friend's cookout, the kind where music drifted lazily from the speakers and the air smelled of grilled chicken and sea salt. Alice had gone reluctantly, coaxed out by friends who insisted she needed a break. She was sitting at the edge of the patio, sipping a soda, when Samuel appeared in her periphery. He didn't so much enter a room as occupy it. People's postures seemed to shift subtly when he passed, their conversations tilting toward him. He noticed her, really noticed her, and with that easy, practiced smile walked over. They spoke for hours that day. The conversation had an unexpected rhythm. His polished anecdotes, her grounded observations, the occasional shared laugh over some small absurdity in the crowd. By the end of the evening, he had her number, and within weeks, their names were being said together, Alice and Samuel, as though they'd always been a pair. For the next 2 years, theirs was the kind of relationship that looked perfect from the outside. Loyal, affectionate, always hand in hand at public gatherings, sharing private jokes at dinner tables. But behind closed doors, the balance was less equal. Alice adjusted her schedule to fit his, softened her opinions to avoid his rare but pointed irritation, and often found herself smoothing over his missteps without ever being asked. Samuel's charm was a current she let herself be carried by, even when it tugged her away from her own shores. What she didn't see, what no one saw, was how that same charm hid a thread of entitlement, a belief that the people who loved him should absorb the consequences of his choices. It was subtle at first, woven into small requests and offhand remarks. But patterns have a way of growing roots, and in Samuel's world, mistakes never really stayed his for long. Alice, without realizing it, was becoming the one who kept his ground steady. And in the quiet spaces between their moments of laughter and warmth, the first shadows were already forming. They would not stay hidden forever. The hum of the Porsche's engine was more than just mechanical noise. It was Samuel's pride and rebellion rolled into one. The night air was crisp, and Miami's winter breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean through the open windows. Streetlights smeared into golden streaks across the windshield as the car devoured the asphalt. Alice kept glancing at the speedometer, her fingers tightening on the seatbelt. "Samuel, slow down," she urged, but her words dissolved into the low growl of the engine. He grinned, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if chasing something only he could see. The red Porsche wasn't just a car. It was a statement. Imported at no small cost, it was meant to turn heads, and tonight, Samuel wanted it to do exactly that. His driver's license had expired months ago while he was away on study in England, but never cared to get a renewal when he came back. Alice's frown deepened when he brushed off her reminder. "Relax," he said. "I've driven faster in worse places." The speed climbed. Neon signs flashed past like ghostly blurs. And then, the moment, a chilling truth under the roar of the tires. On the open road, speed can feel like freedom, until freedom shatters. It happened in seconds. A set of headlights appeared to the left, just as Samuel cut into the next lane. The Porsche clipped the side of a dark sedan. The sound was a gut punch, metal on metal, a sickening crunch. The other car, a silver Toyota, jerked violently, fishtailing before slamming into the central divider. It flipped, a slow-motion tumble of glass and steel, before landing on its roof. Inside was 42-year-old Miriam Carter, a mother of two on her way home from a late shift. Alice's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God!" she gasped, twisting to look back. The world outside the Porsche blurred into chaos. Bystanders shouted. A man dropped his coffee cup, spilling it onto the sidewalk as he ran toward the wreck. The acrid smell of burnt rubber hung in the cold air. Samuel's knuckles went pale against the steering wheel, but his mind was already elsewhere, not on Miriam Carter's fate, not on the twisted wreck behind them, but on himself. He slammed the brakes and veered toward the shoulder. The car jerked to a halt. His chest rose and fell fast, but his voice was steady, urgent. "Switch seats. Please. You're licensed. I can't get arrested." Alice stared at him, stunned. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "What? No." Headlights flared in the rearview mirror, growing larger. Someone was coming. Samuel's voice hardened. "Alice. Now." His urgency wasn't panic. It was desperation. He unbuckled, half climbing over the console. Alice, frozen for a second too long, found herself dragged into the driver's seat. The moment she gripped the wheel, Samuel slid in beside her, breathing hard. The approaching vehicle slowed as it neared the crash scene. People were already gathering, their shouts merging into a distant, frantic hum. Alice's hands trembled on the steering wheel, the weight of what had just happened pressing down like an invisible hand on her chest. Somewhere behind them, Miriam Carter's overturned car lay in the road, its hazard lights flashing weakly, like a dying heartbeat. Samuel didn't look back. He didn't want to. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the humid Miami night, casting fractured shadows across the cracked asphalt. The air smelled faintly of burnt rubber and gasoline, still heavy from the collision. Officers moved with sharp precision, their boots striking the pavement in unison. Samuel was already leaning against the hood of a squad car, wrists bound, his face pale and unreadable. Alice stood a few feet away, trembling, not from the evening air, but from the weight pressing down on her chest. Her mascara had streaked, a silent map of everything she wished she could undo. Neither spoke, though their silence screamed louder than any confession. At Jackson Memorial Hospital, the sterile corridors hummed with fluorescent light. Nurses moved briskly, their hushed tones betraying the urgency they felt. In Trauma Room 4, monitors flatlined in unison with the doctor's voice. Time of death, 11:32 p.m. The words were clinical, detached, but the air in the room grew heavier as if grief itself had taken form. Miriam's body lay still, her once vibrant face now ghostly pale. A nurse gently drew a white sheet over her, the fabric whispering across her skin in the only farewell she would receive that night. By the time the sun rose over Miami-Dade, Alice's name was already etched into the day's court records. Vehicular homicide, second-degree felony. The charge sat cold and absolute on the paperwork, but the reality of it was far more jagged. At her first appearance, the courtroom was thick with a scent of polished wood and faint cologne. Samuel's family occupied an entire row. They did not speak, did not shift, only stared with the stillness of stone, their eyes holding all the words they would never say to her. Her attorney leaned in close, voice low enough that only she could hear. A plea deal is your best shot. It's the difference between spending most of your life behind bars and seeing daylight before your hair turns white. Alice's hands, cuffed in front of her, tightened until her knuckles whitened. Her throat felt like sandpaper, but she nodded. The decision was not born of courage, only the exhausted acceptance of a cornered animal. When the sentence was read, 9 years in Homestead Correctional Institution, the words landed with the finality of a slammed door. The gavel struck once, sharp and decisive, and in that sound, the last thread connecting her to the outside world seemed to snap. As she was led away, she didn't look back toward Samuel's family. She didn't have to. Their silence followed her like a shadow. Some cells are made of concrete, others of choices. And in that moment, the truth of it felt inescapable. Alice had already been living in hers long before the steel bars closed. The cell door clanged shut behind Alice with a kind of metallic finality that seemed to echo through her bones. The first weeks in prison were a blur of noise, cold concrete, and faces that studied her as if weighing whether she would break or blend in. She found her refuge in the prison infirmary, where she volunteered to work. It gave her purpose, changing bandages, handing out aspirin, and sometimes just sitting with sick inmates who needed a human presence. It was the one place where the air didn't feel so suffocating, where she could momentarily pretend she was useful again. Each night, she sat on her narrow bed and wrote letters to Samuel. She poured herself into them, her fears, her hopes, her small victories, always imagining him unfolding the pages with care. At first, she told herself he was busy, that's why his replies came so rarely. But as the months turned into years, the silence became its own form of punishment. The paper she sent out carried her heart, but the paper that should have returned remained stubbornly absent. When Samuel did visit, it was like the world narrowed down to his face through the thick glass. But in 9 years, those visits came only twice. 2 moments to sustain her through nearly a decade. Both times, she left the visiting room with her hands trembling, unsure if his absence afterward hurt more than his presence ever healed. Other inmates noticed. In voiceovers laced through the documentary, their recollections painted the picture for viewers. One said, "She still talked about him like he was the man she left yesterday. Like the man who'd wait forever." Another remembered, "We stopped telling her he wasn't coming. She wouldn't have believed it anyway." Their voices carried the mixture of pity and respect reserved for someone stubborn enough to hold on to hope long past its expiration date. Meanwhile, the outside world kept moving. Alice missed birthdays of nieces and nephews who grew into adults before she saw them again. She learned about her father's death through a brief, awkward letter from her sister, 2 weeks after the funeral. Seasons changed outside those barred windows, and she marked them by the heavier coats guards wore or the way summer heat seeped into the walls. Inside, her life was a collection of routines. Outside, life went on without her. Still, she worked in the infirmary. Still she wrote her letters. Still she waited for the day Samuel would walk back into her life as if no time had passed. The day Alice walked out of the prison gates, the air felt strange. Too open. Too loud. She had dreamt of this moment for years, picturing herself running into sunlight, breathing freedom like it was the sweetest perfume. Instead, the sky above felt almost oppressive, stretching on forever, mocking her with its indifference. Her bag, one thin envelope of belongings, was light in her hand, but her chest felt heavy. The taxi ride back to town was silent, the driver occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror with that half-curious, half-judgmental look strangers always gave. She knew exactly what they saw, a woman with prison in her eyes. Her palms sweated as the city slid past, streets that looked familiar but had aged without her, as if she had been locked away in a snow globe while life outside moved forward. The first call she made was to Samuel. She hadn't thought twice about it. Her heart pounded as the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a flat voice. "The number you have dialed is not in service." She tried again. Same result. It was like a rope snapping in her hands. Determination took over. She spent hours in a corner cafe with weak coffee, scrolling through mutual friends' social media pages, trawling through their photos, scanning for Samuel's face. It felt wrong, invasive, but so had the years she spent behind bars while he built a life without her. And then she found him. His smile was wider than she remembered, his arm wrapped around a woman with sharp cheekbones and expensive hair. In another photo, 2 children played in the background of a pristine yard, a golden retriever darting across perfect grass. Samuel looked older but at peace, like someone who had made all the right turns while she had been left at the dead end. She stared at those images until her eyes stung. Every like, every comment, every cheerful emoji from friends felt like a slap. She wanted to call him out, to demand answers. Why he hadn't waited, why he hadn't even written once. But the truth sat bitter on her tongue. In his story, she was already gone. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary life. Buses grumbling by, people laughing into their phones, shop windows glowing with colors she hadn't seen in years. But every sound felt distant, like she was standing behind glass. Freedom had come, yes, but it wasn't the freedom she'd imagined. It was a room without walls, but also without doors. And Samuel was no longer part of it. Alice's visits to Anne's workplace began subtly. At first, she lingered outside the glass doors of the small law firm where Anne worked as a receptionist, pretending to check her phone or browse a newspaper. But soon, her presence became more brazen. She began walking in, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, and leaving notes folded neatly in the client correspondence tray at the reception desk. The handwriting was bold and unmistakable. "You don't know who your husband really is." Anne's fingers trembled as she read the first note, unsure whether to confront her husband immediately or dismiss it as a cruel prank. She didn't tell Samuel that night. Not yet. But Alice wasn't one to let silence slow her down. 2 days later, Anne found another note, slipped under the reception desk blotter. The truth always finds a way out. This time, the edges of the paper smelled faintly of Samuel's cologne. That was the moment Anne's doubts began to take root. Samuel learned of Alice's visits from a mutual acquaintance who'd spotted the woman at Anne's office. His anger surged, not just at the audacity of Alice's actions, but at the risk she posed to the fragile stability of his home. That evening, he tracked Alice down, catching her just as she was leaving her apartment. He cornered her in the dim hallway, his voice low but charged with fury. "This ends now, Alice. You go near Anne again, and you'll regret it." Alice didn't flinch. Her lips curled into a mocking half-smile, the kind that seemed to say, "I know something you don't." She leaned in close enough for Samuel to feel her breath. "Why should I stop, Samuel? She deserves to know. Or are you afraid she'll believe me?" Her tone dripped with venom, and it was clear, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about control. The next day, Anne confronted Samuel in their kitchen, holding one of the notes between 2 fingers as if it were a piece of rotting fruit. "Do you know her?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Samuel tried to deny it, to dismiss the accusations as lies, but Anne's eyes searched his face for the truth she feared she might already know. The tension reached its peak that night when Samuel drove to Alice's apartment, intent on ending the torment. They stood inches apart in her living room, voices rising, accusations flying like daggers. At one point, Alice shoved him, and he stumbled back, catching himself on the edge of her table. "You've ruined enough, Alice," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Stay out of my life." But Alice's final words before he stormed out would haunt him. "It's not your life anymore, Samuel. It's ours. And she's going to know everything." The day holds on Alice's face as she watches him leave, her expression unreadable, part satisfaction, part something darker. If someone you loved betrayed you like this, would you expose them or let it go? The warm chatter of the networking party hummed in the background as Samuel moved through the crowd, his smile polite but hollow. The glass of champagne in his hand trembled ever so slightly. His phone buzzed, cutting through the noise like a blade. That custom ringtone, low, sharp, unmistakable, pulled his attention. He glanced at the screen. A single text. Package delivered. Stall number 4. His pulse quickened. He excused himself from a group of local businessmen mid-conversation, muttering something about taking a call. His steps carried him to the restroom hallway, away from the laughter and clinking glasses. The lighting dimmed. The air grew colder. Inside stall number 4, tucked neatly in a plain brown bag, lay the instruments of a decision that could never be undone: a black hood, thick gloves, and a suppressed pistol. He shut the stall door behind him, locked it, and stared at the bag for several long seconds. The silence inside felt suffocating. His breathing grew shallow. This wasn't an impulsive move. It was planned. It was calculated. Samuel slipped on the gloves slowly, almost ritualistically, feeling the snug constriction around his fingers. His mind raced, not with doubts, but with the memory of Alice's taunting messages, her smirks, the way she seemed to enjoy unraveling him thread by thread. This, he told himself, was the only way to stop her. The man who once begged for her silence was now ready to silence her forever. Samuel slid the hood over his head, the fabric muffling the world. His eyes, now shadowed, locked onto the weapon. It felt heavier than he expected, but his grip was firm. He tucked it inside his jacket and stepped out of the stall, pausing briefly to check the hallway. The party noises still echoed faintly, but he was no longer part of that world. He moved with purpose now, every step deliberate. The plan was clear: leave through the service exit, circle around to the street, and get to Alice before she had a chance to ruin him completely. Outside, the night air bit at his skin. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the wet pavement. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a car engine revved. Samuel didn't flinch. He walked to the waiting car parked a block away, its engine purring softly. Sliding into the driver's seat, he pulled out his phone again and opened a location tracker. A single red dot pulsed on the screen: Alice's apartment. She was home. The clock on the dashboard read 9:14 p.m. He would be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes until the world changed forever. But as he merged onto the road, something gnawed at him. Not guilt, not fear, something else, an awareness that someone might be watching him. He glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 cars back, a black SUV kept pace. No lane changes, no passing, just there. Samuel's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The game was no longer just between him and Alice. Someone else was moving their piece across the board. The night was thick with a silence that almost hummed. Streetlights washed the narrow lane in a pale, tired yellow, their glow falling in weak pools on the cracked pavement. Samuel stood across from the modest duplex, his breath steady, his eyes locked on the single upstairs window where a faint glow of light leaked from drawn curtains. He had been here many times before, but never with this purpose. He pulled the hood tighter over his head, feeling the rough fabric bite into his jawline, and slipped the black gloves on one finger at a time. The suppressed pistol was cold in his grip, heavy with intent. The old smart lock card sat in his pocket, an artifact of a relationship that had soured into something venomous. He moved quickly, avoiding the security light's reach, until he was standing at the door. A single swipe, a faint click. The door eased open with a whisper, and Samuel slipped inside like a shadow. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and something baking, Alice's habit of warming bread late at night. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Samuel's shoes moved over the carpet without a whisper. He knew the layout by heart. The kitchen was down the hall to the right. Alice was there, humming softly, unaware of the man now stalking her. Her hair was tied loosely, and she was barefoot, moving between the counter and the sink. A small ceramic mug steamed beside her. Samuel stood just at the edge of the doorway, his shadow falling just short of her feet. His mind flashed with their arguments, her threats, the way her voice had cut him like glass. His breathing slowed, and when he finally stepped forward, the floorboard under his shoe gave the faintest groan. Alice turned, startled. "Samuel," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said with chilling calm, "What's that behind you?" It was instinct. She glanced back. The first shot cracked softly in the silence. A dull puff from the suppressor. The bullet tore into her back. Then another, and another. Her body lurched forward, the mug shattering against the tile. She made a choked sound, halfway between a scream and a gasp. The final shot, clean, deliberate, pierced the back of her skull. She collapsed instantly, her head hitting the ground with a hollow thud, steam from the broken mug mingling with the metallic scent of blood. Samuel stood there for a second, not in triumph, but in methodical calculation. His eyes scanned the counters, the floor, making sure nothing was out of place beyond what could be explained by a break-in. He stepped over her body without looking down, retraced his steps to the door, and slipped into the night. He moved through side streets and alleys, avoiding intersections where cameras might watch. 2 blocks away, he found what he was looking for, a public trash bin behind a convenience store. The gloves, the hood, the gun, all dropped inside, buried under fresh garbage. He walked into his car, drove to the city's midnight pulse until he was gone. Somewhere in the darkness, a neighbor's dog began to bark, but by then, Samuel was just another faceless figure lost in the night. Detectives were called to the crime scene barely 20 minutes after the shooting. The living room still smelled faintly of gunpowder, and the eerie silence of the apartment was only broken by the soft click of camera shutters and the scribbling of notes. In the corner, a uniformed officer marked the location of shell casings, while another carefully lifted the edge of a discarded nylon bag. It wasn't until they turned it over under the harsh beam of the evidence light that they noticed something small and rectangular stuck inside the folds, a laminated party entry tag. The tag had a stylized logo from a high-profile private gathering across town that night. Detective Mbeki, who'd been sifting through the crime scene photos on her tablet, glanced at it, then at the timestamp written by the evidence technician. Her instincts pricked. If the tag had been here, it meant someone at that party had left in a hurry, and possibly in the middle of their alibi. Back at the precinct, the team began the laborious process of timeline reconstruction. They requested guest lists, security logs, and surveillance footage from the party venue. A meticulous minute-by-minute cross-check started to form a troubling picture. Samuel's name appeared on the guest list, and indeed, several clips from earlier that evening showed him mingling with guests. But between 9:42 p.m. and 10:06 p.m., during the narrow window when the murder occurred, there was no visual record of him in the party space. Detective Mbeki zoomed in on the footage from the party's VIP restroom corridor. At exactly 9:40 p.m., Samuel was caught pushing the door open, glancing over his shoulder as if to check for witnesses. 2 minutes later, the same camera caught him emerging with a bulky black package tucked discreetly under his arm, the same dimensions as the nylon bag now in evidence. Meanwhile, the forensics lab had finished processing the bag and a pair of latex gloves found near a dumpster a few blocks from the crime scene. The report was damning. Clear fingerprints on the inside cuffs of the gloves, and a partial print smudged along the seam of the bag. Samuel's prints. No one could argue accidental transfer. The prints were pressed deep, suggesting he had worn the gloves and handled the bag directly. By the time Becky laid out the evidence on the incident board, the recovered party tag, the missing time gap, the forensics match, and the suspicious restroom footage, a clear story was beginning to take shape. The case was no longer about whether Samuel had been present at the murder. It was about proving he had stepped away from a carefully constructed alibi to execute it. But the detectives knew they were dealing with a man who calculated every move. Samuel hadn't just vanished from the party. He had timed his exit, concealed his weapon, and re-entered without drawing attention. It was the kind of surgical precision that suggested planning, not passion. And planning meant premeditation, a crucial detail that could push the charge from simple homicide to first-degree murder. Still, as the room fell quiet and the crime board filled with red string connections, Becky felt the weight of the missing piece, the murder weapon itself. Without it, Samuel could still claim someone else had used the bag and gloves, framing him with planted evidence. It was a dangerous gap, and Samuel was just the type to exploit it. The knock on Samuel's apartment door was not the kind you could ignore. It was loud, unrelenting, and backed by the weight of law. By the time he opened it, the hallway was filled with armed officers in tactical vests. His name was read aloud with the formal coldness of an arrest warrant, and within seconds he was on the ground, hands cuffed tightly behind his back. Samuel tried to shout his innocence, but the words came out cracked, trembling, more like a plea than a defense. The police car's back seat felt smaller than it should, the metal cage pressing in as they drove him away. The sound of the siren was faint in the distance, yet the silence inside was deafening. This wasn't just the loss of freedom. It was the moment he realized his game was over. The trial began under the thick weight of public interest. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, their lenses eager to capture the man accused of killing someone who had once called him family. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy, charged with anticipation. The prosecution wasted no time constructing their case, a narrative of cold-blooded betrayal. They showed how Samuel had planned everything, how he had hidden behind charm and familiarity to mask a brutal intent. The phrase they repeated, almost like a haunting refrain, was self-preservation turned predatory. They walked the jury through the evidence. The party entry tag, the forensic match of his fingerprints on the nylon bag and gloves, the surveillance footage of him picking up what they chillingly called the package. Piece by piece, it was all there, each fact another nail in the coffin of his defense. The defense tried to counter, arguing that circumstantial evidence was being stretched, that Samuel had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, that others had more reason to harm the victim. But every witness called by the prosecution seemed to strip away those layers of doubt. The restroom attendant testified seeing Samuel emerge with a bulge under his jacket. A forensic pathologist described the cause of death in a tone so clinical it left the jury wincing. As the trial neared its end, the betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. The prosecution played on that emotional wound, pointing out that the victim had once served prison time for Samuel, a sacrifice that, instead of inspiring loyalty, seemed to have inspired elimination. They didn't just call him a killer. They called him a man who tried to erase a debt by erasing a life. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, there was no hesitation in the foreperson's voice. Guilty. First-degree murder. The sentence was immediate. Life without the possibility of parole. Samuel stared ahead, eyes empty, as if the meaning hadn't landed. But the weight of it was unmistakable. This was a life sentence without an exit. Outside, the rain had started, a cold, steady drizzle that seemed to wash the courthouse steps. She served his time. He tried to take her life. In the end, justice took both. When loyalty becomes your prison, how far would you go before breaking free? Some debts are paid in years, others in blood. Alice gave Samuel her freedom, believing love would shield her from harm. Instead, it became the knife at her back. In that courtroom, the verdict wasn't just a sentence. It was the universe's final, bitter reply to a woman's misplaced faith. Justice came late, wrapped in the cold hands of consequence. It could not restore what was stolen, but it stood as a lasting reminder. Betrayal has a price, and some debts, once collected, leave no one whole, only hollow. If you were Alice, would you have forgiven and walked away? Or what else would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments and see you in our next episode.